Hi, good morning, everyone. Welcome to our Parsha class on this big Tuesday here in our nation. It just seems appropriate to start the morning with Torah. And I also hope that you're starting your morning with something that you like to drink. I'm a big coffee drinker, so I can't really imagine not studying Torah with some coffee in my hand. So I hope you get to enjoy. I'm enjoying. And I also feel really lucky, although I would say this for any Parsha, that I get to discuss Lech Lecha with all of you this morning. Of course, when you study any Torah portion, it's hard to study the entire Parsha, and how could I not really dive into the first few verses because they are the most famous. And so if you have the text in front of you or Chumash, but I'm going to be reading just the beginning of chapter 12. Vayomer Adonai El Avram Lech Lecha. So God said to Avram, remember his name has not been changed yet, go forth, Lech Lecha. And then we're given the specifics from your native land, from your father's house to the land that I will show you. So from your native land, from your birthplace, from your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. That's probably one of the most famous lines of all in the Torah, and you shall be a blessing. So the question that I want to really ponder with all of you this morning is why Abraham? Why this particular person? Why did God choose? And I'm even making an assumption there, but why did God choose this person to be the leader of the Jewish people? Just gonna make sure that I don't install anything here at the same time. And so what I want to do is actually backtrack for a moment. The reason why I'm asking that question is in the context of coming off of last week's Parsha, of coming off the context of Noah, because you remember the story. Noah is chosen by God to save his family, to save two of each species, if you will, to build this ark. But we're given a specific reason as to why Noah is chosen out of everyone else in the world to be saved. And what we're told is that Noah walked with God and that he was blameless or perfect, Tamim, however you want to translate that word, blameless or perfect within his generation, Dorotav. And there's so many great pieces of rabbinic commentary, and if you will, a little bit of rabbinic controversy as to whether Noah was actually blameless, whether he was actually perfect, or was he just righteous in comparison and contrast to everyone else. If you think about it, if you live among monsters, then you certainly stand out as an angel. But if you're just an average Joe or average regular person among angels, you might not stand out at all. Either way, Noah was chosen, and the reason is given. But Abraham is a different story. And I wanted to give you an interesting piece of commentary. Simi Peters, she's the author of Learning to Read, Midrash, gives the following commentary in regards to that idea of Abraham versus Noah. It's called The Unknown Abraham. And this is what Simi Peters says. And if you're interested learning to read Midrash, it's a 21st century English book that gives a systematic approach to studying Midrash. And this is what Simi Peters says. When we compare the beginnings of Noah and Abraham's stories, we're struck by a puzzling incongruity. The text comments on God's choice of Noah to be the saving remnant of humanity. But Abraham, surely the more pivotal figure, is virtually an unknown when we encounter him. God's selection of Noah is understandable, as I said before, because Noah was considered a righteous man. He was perfect in his generations, and the Lord walked with Noah. In contrast, the opening verses of the Abraham story give us no motivation for God's choice of Abraham. The only things we know of Abraham before God tells him to leave his father's house are the names of his relatives and that he's left Ur. The omission is provoking. Clearly, there's a gap in the narrative fabric of the text. And so this morning, let's say, for the next 20 minutes or so, we'll see how we do. I want to try to explore that idea of why do we not see any motivation given in the original text as to why God chose Abraham? What are we not seeing? And because we're not seeing the motivation or reading the motivation, does that omission speak volumes as to why Abraham is the leader of the Jewish people? So I'm going to give you, I think I'm giving you 3 different answers this morning. And if you're watching live or you're watching later, you can feel free to email me at nguzik, Nguzik, at sinaitemple.org and share with me some of your thoughts as to why was Abraham chosen. So the first answer that I want to share with you comes from a Jerusalem Post article written by Rabbi Dr. Shlomo Riskin. And this is what he says, and I think it's fascinating. He says, so why did God choose Abraham? Maimonides, the great Jewish philosopher, is also struck by this question. Abraham, this is what Maimonides is offering. Abraham chose God. Okay, do you hear the switch? The question I've been asking thus far is, why did God choose Abraham? But Rabbi Dr. Shlomo Riskin brings in Maimonides, who posits maybe that's not the situation. Maybe it's actually that Abraham chose God. Maimonides maintains that Abraham found God through his own reasoning powers. After this mighty man was weaned, he began to explore and think. Though he was a child, he began to think incessantly throughout the day and night, wondering until, as a result of his own correct understanding, he reached the truth. So in other words, what I want to offer you as perhaps answer number 1 is the question isn't, why was Abraham chosen by God? The situation we should be exploring for a few moments is how Abraham chose God, how Abraham chose monotheism. He began his journey, and it was God perhaps revealing a path for Abraham that had clearly already been there since he was a young child. But again, we don't see that in the text because we just learn about Abraham, or if you will, Avram, just from that first line that I read to you. And so what we have to do is look at a few pieces of midrash, a few pieces of rabbinic commentary, as I said, that kind of fills in the gaps for us. And these pieces of midrash, rabbinic commentary, come from Breshit Rabbah. And this is where I think we get a clearer picture as to who Abraham is, his personality, who he is as a young child, and really the kind of character that we need to help start as the primary figure and patriarch of the Jewish people. So Midrash number 1. And some of these might sound familiar. In fact, some of these pieces of Midrash, often if you'll ask, kids who have gone through religious school or, whatever it may be, and someone says, hey, tell me something about Abraham, they'll quote a piece of these different rabbinic commentaries, but often people will quote them so often they'll think that they're actually in the Torah. They're not. This is not in the Torah. Again, this is rabbinic commentary. So Midrash number 1. Upon seeing the moon and stars, Abraham said, this one must have created heaven and earth and me. These stars must have been the moon's princes. So if you hear that, you can imagine a young child looking up at the stars and gazing and saying to himself, you know what? It must be the moon and the stars that created everything else and created me. And so all night long, Abraham stood in prayer to the moon. But in the morning, the moon sank in the west and the sun rose in the east. And then Abraham said, no, there's no might in either of these, because he actually witnesses both kind of celestial beings disappearing in the sky. And so he says to himself at a very young age, we're told that this particular midrash, maybe he was, like I said, 3 years old, something. They say, after he was weaned. So whenever he was able to have kind of these developmental thoughts, so somewhere between the ages of 1 and 3, he says to himself, there must be a higher Lord over them. To God will I pray, and before God will I prostrate myself. And so even at a very young age, a toddler, if you will, Abraham begins to doubt and he begins to question. And I just love that beginning, that the Jewish people began with curiosity, wondering, could it be the stars that rule over us? Could it be the moon? Could it be the sun? No, there has to be something greater. There has to be something, must be a God, one God that rules over all. So that's Midrash number 1. But let's think about Midrash number 2, which maybe is more familiar to all of you. So again, from Breshit Rabbah. And this is the one that people often point to as, they think it's in the Torah, but it's not. Rabbi Chia said, Terach, Abraham's father, was an idol worshiper, and he owned a shop, an idol shop. And once he went on a trip, and he placed his son Abraham in charge of the store in his place. And when a man would come in to buy an idol, Abraham would ask him, well, how old are you, sir? And the man would reply, I'm 50 years old. And Abraham would reply, woe to this man, you are 50 years old, and yet you bow down to one who is only a day old, meaning this idol was just created about a minute ago, and you're 50 years old and you're going to bow down to something that was just created, through clay, within the last 24 hours. The man would then feel embarrassed and slink away. The Midrash continues, one time a woman came carrying a dish of fine flour, and she said to Abraham, here, offer this before them. And Abraham picked up a staff and broke the idols and placed the staff in the hands of the largest of them. Because Abraham was confounded. He was supposed to be able to feed these idols with flour. And so he thought he might kind of play a trick on his dad. So when his father returned, he asked them, why did you do this to them? Okay, you heard, he broke the idols. And then he puts the staff, blaming it on another idol. Abraham replied, why would I hide it from you? A woman came carrying a plate of fine flour, and she told me to offer it to them. And each one of them said, I'll eat it first, until the largest of them picked up the staff and shattered the others. And Terach responds, why are you trying to fool me? I know what they are. And Abraham retorts, do your ears not hear what your mouth is saying? And so I love the Midrash so much, because here you have a young boy who is in charge of the store, of the idol shop. And, he has 2 adults come in, and he's just perplexed. How is it possible that these adults don't understand that these are just pieces of clay? These are just objects. And even when his father comes back and Abraham decides to kind of enter the same persona as the adults who came into the shop, saying, those idols, they fought amongst themselves for that plate of flour. His father knows in his heart, these idols aren't real. And so answer number 1, I am offering you as to why Abraham was chosen, or rather why Abraham chose God, is because this wasn't something that Abraham chose or thought of overnight. This was a spiritual, lifelong journey in which finally Abraham and God came into relationship, but only after Abraham welcomed a life of questioning and doubting and wondering and challenging. And I think it is so fitting that the first Jew began rooted and anchored in spiritual questioning. So I also want to offer you a few other reasons, but I love that first answer. So a few other reasons as to why Abraham was chosen, or again, why Abraham chose God. So this is a beautiful piece of Midrash, a Midrash, again, from Breshit Rabbah, that tries to answer that question. Why was Abraham chosen? And so listen to the imagery. The Midrash offers the following story. It also tries to answer the question, while Abraham was walking, if you will, what is it that he saw that led him to have kind of this faith moment where he decides to leave his home and his birthplace and go to the land that God will show him. So Rabbi Yitzchak says, this is analogous to one, meaning Abraham, who was passing from place to place and saw a building with a candle burning in it. And he said, is it possible that this building has no one in charge of it? The owner of the building looked out at him and said, I am the owner of the building. So because Abraham, our patriarch, was saying, is it possible that this world is without someone in charge? The Holy One of Blessing, God looked at him and said, I am the owner of the world. The king, meaning God, will desire your beauty as he is your master, to show your beauty in the world and bow to him. That is, the Lord said to Avram. So Rabbi Andy Sugarman, who's one of my classmates from rabbinical school now 20 years ago, he explains the following. He says, like many of the early rabbis, Rabbi Yitzchak imagines a backstory to explain how and why Avram would respond to a sudden call from God to leave his home for an unknown land. The meaning of this parable, however, hinges on an ambiguous term, birah doleket, that describes what caught Abraham's attention and transformed his vision. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel discusses the implications of two contrasting translations. That Abraham saw perhaps a palace, I use the word building, but you can say palace, full of light, versus a palace in flames. And in his masterpiece, Heschel's God in Search of Man says that both deserve equal consideration for informing our own worldview. He continues, Rabbi Sugarman, in imagining the world as a palace full of light, Heschel develops Avram into a personality who discovers through wonder that there must be a creator who would both design and care for such a stunningly magnificent domain. He posits that Avram's journey began not just with his own sense of awe for nature, but with the action he takes in response to God's answer that such a source of light exists. But towards the end of God in Search of Man, Heschel acknowledges an entirely different approach to religion. He asserts that just as many sense the ultimate questions in moments of horror, and perhaps Avram looked around himself in that moment and he saw a palace in flames. In other words, a world engulfed in an inferno of chaos and evil. And so God's answer to Avram represents this still small voice of resilience that somehow provides courage and hope in the face of tragedy and destruction. In this light, Avram finds reason to believe in God, the world, and himself in spite of the seemingly overwhelming evidence to the contrary. And Rabbi Sugarman ends his beautiful piece with the following. Heschel's dual treatment of this parable captures the full range of awesome and awful emotions that the ancient rabbis express in their love and fear of God. As a modern-day Abraham, Heschel asserted that post-Holocaust Judaism must engage both radical amazement and righteous indignation as responses to the beautiful and terrible experiences we find in life. He ends with, may we walk with God in both paths, with conviction and grace. And I think this is me. I think it's a beautiful, hopeful, and heart-wrenching response to the world that we find ourselves in today. That Abraham was perhaps chosen or chose his own path as the first Jew to remind us that we can look at the world with those same kinds of eyes, that we too should look at the world and be in constant awe. It's a world in which we've inherited that really comes with such blessing. But additionally, it's a world in which we look at it with a little bit of horror, knowing that it's our responsibility and that we were chosen and we should continue to choose our path every single day to fix this beautiful and broken world. So in summary, why did Abraham choose that path? Or why was Abraham chosen? Because he really saw this world engulfed in flames and saw a world illuminated by God's beauty. And not every person has that same kind of eyesight. It's something that we aspire to. But that's what Abraham was able to see, or at least it's what God revealed to Abraham. So finally, one more answer as to why I think Abraham was chosen for this path. And this is also a story that you may know well. This is the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, where Abraham is again horrified because he hears that God is enraged by all of the evil and destruction in these towns, and understands that God is about to wipe out these evil cities. And so Abraham comes forward and starts to, if you will, I don't know if barter is the right word, but he starts to protest God's actions. And in Bereshit chapter 18, this is what happens. This is right from the text. Abraham came forward and said, and this is to God, will you sweep away the innocent with the guilty? What if there should be 50 innocent within the city? Will you wipe out the place and not forgive it for the sake of the innocent 50 who are in it? Far be it from you to do such a thing, to bring death upon the innocent as well as the guilty, so that the innocent and guilty fare alike. Far be it from you. Isn't it great that Abraham is telling God, God, this is not who you are. You are not this kind of person who treats the innocent and guilty as the same. And so what does God say? Okay, if I find within the city 50 innocent ones, I'll forgive the whole place for their sake. But Abraham doesn't stop at that. I feel like Abraham is like a really great teenage negotiator. Abraham speaks up and says, listen, I venture to speak, my Lord. Who am I but dust and ashes? But what if the 50 innocents should lack 5? Are you going to destroy the whole city for the want of 5? I will not destroy if I find 45 there, says God. And Abraham just pushes. What if there's 40? What if there's 30? What if there's 20? What if there's 10? And what you find with Abraham is someone who is willing to speak up, even if he's the only one. And about Abraham, the great Hasidic master, Rabbi Simcha Bunim says the following. And I hope that you really hold this piece of commentary to heart. It's not enough for the righteous to park themselves on the benches of the Beit Midrash, the house of study. Instead, the righteous must find themselves in the middle of the city, mixed in with the people, inextricably involved in the actions of the world. This is what a tzaddik is. As such, God will raise up and forgive the whole of the city on behalf of their actions. And so why was Abraham chosen to be a leader? Why was he chosen to be the patriarch of the Jewish people? I think because he wasn't afraid to speak up or speak out. And it's a lesson to all of us. We are not meant to live in this world as passive observers, but God expects to hear our voice, even ones of curiosity and frustration, even anger. And I think God would rather us express our anger to God than express our anger towards each other. And finally, there's just one more piece that I want to leave you with this morning. And I hope you've had a fun time thinking about why Abraham was chosen or why Abraham chose God. But Yehuda Amichai, the famous Israeli poet, in his last book of poetry, published before his death, wrote the following. We are all children of Abraham, but we're also the grandchildren of Terach, Abraham's father. And maybe it's high time the grandchildren did unto their father as he did unto his when he shattered his idols and images, his religion and his faith. That too would be the beginning of a new religion. And although Amichai, I believe, was perhaps through his poetry commenting on kind of the demise or come to in a world of AI, in a world in which cell phones take the place in front of our faces much more than the faces of those we love. When being on the internet feels like being in connection with a friend when really we should be spending more time at coffee shops with our cup of coffee and connecting in person. When all of these replacements end up feeling like systems of worship. Today, if we were able to name what it is in our world that seems as if it is causing a world engulfed in flames, and God was saying to us, I need your attention. I need you to look over here because this is what is causing the fire in our world. This is what's causing the fire, and it's really blocking your attention as to what is illuminating this world. Would we even notice at all? Are the idols that we are worshiping distracting us so much that we're unable to hear God's voice yelling, screaming at each one of us to get off of our bench and be the tzaddik that the world needs? Perhaps what we were supposed to learn from Lech Lecha is that God is choosing us every single day. God chose Abraham because Abraham chose God. And so I'm hopeful that this morning, this week, this year, we choose to live our lives in a way that we have our eyes wide open to whatever is engulfed in flames before us, whatever it is that God wants us to see, so that we can transform a world engulfed in flames to a world that is illuminated with light. I think that God is choosing us over and over and over again, but it's up to us, just like Abraham, whether or not we're willing to choose God back. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you so much for learning with us. And each week, each Tuesday, we have Parsha class, so I hope that you'll come back next week. Have a wonderful day.